The conference room felt different that morning. I had prepared for that presentation for 6 weeks, late nights, revised spreadsheets, and careful calculations. My promotion to senior director was finally within reach. I set my laptop on the table, smiled at the leadership panel, and clicked to my first slide. Then the door opened. My brother Daniel walked in 3 minutes late, which was unusual. He was always early. He carried a folder I didn't recognize and sat at the far end of the table with a small, tight smile that sent a cold feeling straight down my spine. I was 2 slides in when he raised his hand slowly. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, standing up, "but leadership needs to see something important before we continue." He connected his own laptop to the projector. My presentation disappeared. His appeared. And right there, in front of the entire leadership team, Daniel dismantled everything I had built, using data that made my proposal look reckless, poorly researched, and even dangerous. The room went completely silent. My boss, Mr. Harrington, leaned forward with a frown I had never seen directed at me before. The meeting was adjourned 10 minutes later. My promotion was dead. "My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina." Before I go any further with the story, if you enjoy real-life stories about strength, strategy, and justice, please subscribe to this channel because you will not want to miss a single word of what comes next. In the hours after the meeting, nobody called me. Not Mr. Harrington. Not my father, William, who had old professional ties to people in the company. Not a single colleague who had sat in that room and watched Daniel destroy my reputation in real time. The silence felt worse than any confrontation would have. I sat at my desk staring at my screen, waiting for an email, a text, anything. Nothing came. People walked past my office and looked away quickly, the way people look away from an accident they want no part of. That evening I drove home in a daze. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop, telling myself I just needed to review my files and make sense of what had happened. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach drop completely. The data Daniel had used at the meeting, the figures that made my proposal look dangerous, they had been pulled from my working drafts. Not the final versions I had shared through official company channels. My working drafts. Private folders I kept on the company's internal drive. Folders that only I had access to. I stared at the screen for a long time, my tea growing cold beside me. One question repeated in my mind like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop. How did Daniel get inside my files? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and replayed every conversation Daniel and I had shared over the past 8 months. The small comments that had felt harmless at the time began to look completely different now. "You're overthinking the risk assessment, Maya." He had said that back in February, while looking over my shoulder at my screen during a team lunch. I had assumed he was just being helpful. Leadership responds better to conservative numbers. He said that in March, after glancing at a project summary I had left open on my laptop during a family dinner. So casual. So friendly. "Have you run those projections by anyone else?" April. Over coffee. Not his project. Not his department. I sat up in bed and grabbed a notebook. I wrote down every conversation I could remember. Every question he had asked that now felt less like curiosity and more like a probe. Every moment he had leaned a little too close to my screen. Every time he had referenced details I had never shared officially. Daniel's own department had nothing to do with the Horizon project. His repeated interest in my work had no professional reason behind it. I had assumed it was family pride. But sitting there with a pen in my hand and months of memories laid out in front of me, only one explanation made sense. This was not a mistake. This had been planned from the beginning. I went to see my father the following Sunday. I needed someone in my corner. Someone who knew both Daniel and me, who could look at what had happened with clear eyes and tell me I wasn't imagining things. My father, William, had retired from his own business 3 years earlier. He was a steady, calm man, the kind of person who believed in thinking things through before drawing conclusions. I had trusted his judgment my entire life. I sat across from him at his kitchen table and laid out everything carefully. The meeting, the data, the private folder access, the 8 months of questions from Daniel that now felt calculated rather than curious. My father listened without interrupting. He nodded slowly. He refilled his coffee cup. Then he said exactly the thing I had been afraid he might say. Maya, Daniel is your brother. He wouldn't do something like that deliberately. Maybe he was just trying to protect the company from a proposal he thought was risky. He accessed my private files, Dad. You don't know that for certain yet. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Let this cool off first. Don't do anything drastic. I drove home with his words sitting heavy in my chest. He hadn't told me I was wrong, but he hadn't believed me either. If I wanted justice, I understood clearly in that moment, I was going to have to find it entirely on my own. The email from HR arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after the meeting. I read it twice before the words fully landed. I had been removed from the Horizon project. Temporarily, the email said, while an internal review takes place to ensure the integrity of the proposal process. The language was careful and polished. It was also a gut punch dressed in professional clothing. By Friday of that same week, Daniel had been formally assigned as interim project lead. I found out through an internal announcement sent to the entire department. Not through my boss. Not through a private conversation. Through a group email I was still copied on, probably by someone's oversight. I read Daniel's name at the top of that announcement and felt my face go hot. Then cold. Then completely blank. He messaged me that afternoon. Just one line. Thanks for laying the groundwork, Maya. I'll make sure the team carries it forward well. I stared at that message for a full minute. I thought about everything I wanted to say, the anger, the disbelief, the sharp hurt of being betrayed by someone I had grown up trusting. I typed nothing. I closed the message, because something changed in me in that exact moment. Something quiet and sharp and completely final. Anger was just a reaction. I needed a strategy. And I was going to build one that Daniel would never see coming. I cried once. That Wednesday night, alone in my apartment, I sat on the bathroom floor and let myself feel the full weight of everything. The betrayal, the humiliation, the helplessness of watching someone use your own hard work to cut you down in front of the people who mattered most. I gave myself 1 hour. Then I washed my face, made strong coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. I wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Clean, undeniable, professional. Those would be my rules going forward. No public arguments with Daniel in hallways. No emotional outbursts in meetings. No venting to colleagues who might carry my words back to the wrong ears. No reactive decisions made from a wound that was still bleeding. If Daniel had been calculating, I would be more so. If he had been patient, I would be more patient. The people who win these kinds of battles don't win them by screaming the loudest. They win by building a case so carefully constructed, so thoroughly documented, that the truth simply cannot be ignored any longer. That was exactly what I was going to do. I didn't know yet precisely how I would prove what Daniel had done. But I knew where to start. The files. The timestamps. The digital trail that every single action inside a company's system leaves behind whether people realize it or not. I was going to find every piece of it. I started with the archived emails. My company used an internal system that stored every version of every document sent through official channels. Most employees didn't know how far back the archive went. I did because I had spent 3 years working closely with our IT compliance team on a data governance project, experience that was now going to prove more useful than I ever imagined. I submitted a request to access my own archived files under the company's standard employee audit rights policy. A routine, quiet request that raised no flags from anyone. What I found made me sit very still at my screen. The data Daniel had presented at the March meeting, the specific figures he had used to make my proposal look reckless, came from a draft I had created on March 14th. But Daniel had told leadership he had reviewed my work over the preceding weeks and grown increasingly concerned. Here was the problem with that statement. The draft he had used didn't exist until March 14th. And according to the email timestamps stored in the archived system, Daniel had sent his very first internal message raising concerns about my project on March 10th. 4 days before the document he claimed to have reviewed even existed. It was a small crack, just one inconsistency in a wall of confident lies. But every wall eventually falls when you find the right crack. I saved everything carefully and closed the archive. I had my first solid anchor. 3 weeks after the meeting, I received an unexpected phone call. The number was out of state, an area code I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer anyway. The caller introduced herself as Patricia Wade, a senior talent recruiter from Vantage Group. Vantage was a well-regarded consulting firm with a growing reputation in our industry, and importantly, a firm that partnered regularly with my current company on joint contracts. Patricia said she had been given my name by a former colleague who had moved to Vantage the previous year. She had heard about my work on the Horizon project and wanted to discuss a senior leadership position she was working to fill. I listened carefully. I asked a few measured questions. I thanked her and told her I would think about it. After I hung up, I sat quietly in my living room for a long moment. I hadn't gone looking for a way out, but one had appeared, and it had appeared at precisely the right time. Joining Vantage would mean operating in the same professional space as my current company. Leaving for a better position on my own terms would tell a very different story than being quietly sidelined while Daniel dismantled my project. I didn't accept the offer. Not yet. But I saved Patricia's number, and for the first time, I began to think carefully about the word leverage. Daniel changed noticeably after he took over the Horizon project. The change was subtle at first, a slightly straighter posture in meetings, a new habit of speaking just a half-second longer than necessary. But within a month of his appointment, the shift was impossible to miss by anyone who was paying attention. He began weighing in on things well beyond his project scope. He offered opinions in department meetings that nobody had asked for. He referenced my original work in ways that subtly implied it had needed someone more capable to rescue it. The early framework was a decent foundation, he told a group of colleagues one morning, completely unaware I was standing 3 steps behind him in the hallway. But it needed someone to tighten the risk parameters significantly. He was rewriting history in real time, and people around him were listening. I watched all of this and said absolutely nothing. I smiled whenever our eyes met in meetings. I responded to his occasional direct messages professionally and without any warmth. I gave him nothing to react to, because I understood something important about people like Daniel, people who operate from ego and entitlement. When they feel no resistance, they expand. They grow bolder. They start making mistakes they would never make if they felt someone watching carefully. I was watching. I needed him comfortable. I needed him careless. Week by week, that was exactly what he was becoming. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 42 days after the original meeting. Daniel sent a follow-up memo to the full leadership team explaining the key risk factors that had made my original Horizon proposal problematic. It was 4 pages long, detailed, and written with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. He copied me on it. I think he meant it as a final statement, a formal documentation of my supposed failure, delivered with my name visible on the thread for everyone to see. He had made a serious mistake. I printed the memo and set it beside the spreadsheet he had used at the original meeting. Then I read both documents carefully, line by line, making notes in the margin as I went. By the 2nd page of the memo, I had found the first contradiction. By the 3rd page, I had found 2 more. In the memo, Daniel described certain risk factors as clearly present in the original data. But the spreadsheet he had used at the meeting to prove those same risk factors showed different numbers entirely, numbers that did not support the claims he was now making in his own memo. He had been so confident, so certain that I would never push back, that he hadn't even bothered to keep his own story consistent between documents. I made clean copies of both and added them to my growing file. He had just handed me exactly what I needed most. I started treating the documentation like a second job. Every evening after work, I spent at least an hour at my kitchen table going through records, emails, version histories, meeting summaries, timestamp logs from the internal archive system. I organized everything into one folder on my personal hard drive and backed it up in 2 separate places. I wasn't building a revenge file. I was building a case. There is an important difference. Revenge is emotional. It wants to cause pain in return for pain received. A case is logical. It wants to prove a fact. Facts don't require emotion. They don't waver under pressure. They don't need anyone to believe them before the evidence is presented. They simply exist, patient and immovable, waiting for the right moment to surface. My folder grew steadily. By the end of the third week, I had documented the timestamp inconsistency, the one that showed Daniel raising concerns 4 days before the draft he claimed to have reviewed even existed. I had the memo contradictions. I had a detailed written log of every conversation I could recall where he had asked questions about my project. I had the original access permissions for my working draft folders, clearly showing only my credentials were authorized to enter them. And buried inside a routine file audit, I had found something else, an access log showing exactly when files were opened and by which credentials. I printed it and set it aside carefully. The time to analyze it fully would come very soon. The family dinner happened on a Saturday evening in late April. My father hosted it the way he always did. A big pot of food, the television murmuring in the background, everyone crowded around the table telling old stories. Under normal circumstances, I would have enjoyed it. That evening, I watched Daniel more than I ate. He was relaxed, comfortable, the particular ease of someone who believes they have already gotten away with something. Halfway through the meal, the conversation turned to work. It always did in our family. My uncle asked how things were going at the company. Daniel leaned back in his chair with a small, satisfied smile. "It's been a significant few months," he said. "Taking over the Horizon project has been a real challenge, but a good one." He paused, then added very casually, "Maya has always had strong instincts on the details side of things. Big picture thinking is just a different muscle entirely." There was awkward laughter around the table. A few pairs of eyes flicked briefly toward me. I smiled politely and reached for my water glass. Inside, something hardened into a clear and final decision. He had just insulted me in front of our entire family, casually, wearing a smile, wrapped in language designed to let him deny he meant anything by it. He had done it because he believed completely that he was untouchable. That dinner was the absolute last time I would allow him to rewrite my story. The announcement arrived on a Monday morning through a company-wide email. Due to conflicting internal interpretations regarding the Horizon project proposal process, leadership had engaged an external auditing firm to conduct an independent review. All project documentation from the past 12 months would be carefully examined. Key team members would be interviewed individually. The email was professional and completely neutral in tone. It named nobody directly. It implied nothing specific about wrongdoing. But I read it 3 times and felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months. Someone in leadership had noticed the inconsistencies. Perhaps it was the contradictions between Daniel's memo and his original spreadsheet. Perhaps it was the timestamp issues I had documented. Or perhaps it was simply that the Horizon project had begun underperforming since Daniel took over, and questions were beginning to surface naturally. It didn't matter what had triggered it. The audit was real, and it was happening. I thought about calling my father. I considered texting Daniel just to observe his response. I did neither. Instead, I went to my kitchen table that evening and reviewed every document in my folder one final time. I organized everything into a clean, logical sequence, not by emotion, but by chronology. Event by event. Date by date. File by file. I looked at Daniel's growing confidence over the past months and almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because I already knew exactly what the auditors were going to find. The auditing firm began its work the following week. Their team set up quietly in a corner conference room and worked through the company's records in a systematic, unhurried way. They submitted document requests to multiple departments. They scheduled individual interviews with team members connected to the Horizon project over the following 2 weeks. Daniel volunteered to be interviewed first. I heard about it from a colleague who had seen him walking to the conference room with a leather portfolio under his arm, looking composed and thoroughly prepared. He had framed himself, I was told, as the professional who had identified serious problems with my original proposal, someone who had acted out of careful concern for the company. He was presenting himself as the whistleblower who had saved the day. When my own interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday, I prepared very differently. I brought no emotional arguments, no personal grievances, no mention of family history or wounded feelings. I carried a printed copy of my full documentation folder, organized by date, clearly labeled, with key inconsistencies flagged with small color-coded notes. I walked the auditors through the timeline calmly and methodically. The timestamp showing Daniel's concerns predating the draft he claimed to have reviewed. The contradictions between his memo and his own spreadsheet. The access permission records showing only my credentials were authorized for my working folders. I answered every question directly and stopped talking the moment I had finished answering it. When I stood to leave, one of the auditors looked up from her notes and gave me a small, measured nod. 2 days after my audit interview, Patricia Wade called again. Vantage Group had finalized the details of the senior leadership position and was ready to put a formal offer on the table. The role was Director of Strategic Projects, one full level above where I currently sat, with a team of 11 reporting directly to me, complete project autonomy, and a compensation package significantly better than anything my current company had ever discussed with me. I asked for 48 hours to consider it carefully. After I hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time without turning on any lights. 6 months earlier, I would have seen leaving as defeat. Losing the promotion had already been painful enough. Walking out the door would have felt like Daniel had won everything completely. But the situation had shifted entirely since those early dark weeks. I had the audit in motion. I had my documentation. I had the truth working its way steadily toward the surface, moving forward on its own momentum without needing me to push it. I didn't need to stay in order to be vindicated. The vindication was already coming regardless of where I was sitting when it arrived. Accepting the Vantage offer would mean choosing my own future instead of waiting for my current company to decide it for me. It meant leaving on my terms, not being quietly pushed out. I hadn't made my final decision yet, but I recognized clearly that for the first time in many months, all the power in this situation was sitting entirely with me. Somewhere in the 4th week of the audit, Daniel made a mistake so serious it changed everything. I noticed it first not through any official channel, but through a quiet but unmistakable shift in his behavior. The confident hallway presence disappeared almost overnight. The unsolicited opinions in department meetings went completely silent. He arrived at his desk earlier and left later each day, staring at his screen with a focused, slightly desperate expression of someone trying to fix a problem they hadn't anticipated. 3 days after I noticed this change, a colleague who worked near the auditing team's conference room mentioned that the auditors had submitted a secondary document request, specifically asking for version histories and digital creation logs from the project's file system. Then I heard the piece that confirmed everything I had suspected. Daniel had submitted additional supporting documentation to the audit team. Documents he presented as prior analysis, work he claimed to have completed before the original March meeting, which he said supported his concerns about my proposal all along. But the auditors had noticed something that Daniel, in his growing panic, had failed to account for. The metadata on those submitted documents, the invisible digital fingerprint that every file carries automatically, showed they had been created weeks after the original meeting had already taken place. He had fabricated supporting evidence and submitted it to an official audit. The auditors had noticed. The entire game had changed. The meeting request came from Mr. Harrington's office on a Wednesday morning. It was marked private. No additional attendees listed, no agenda description shared. Just a time, a floor, and a room number. I chose my most professional outfit for that day. I brought only a small notepad and a pen. My full documentation had already been submitted to the audit team months earlier. There was nothing left for me to prove going into that room. I simply needed to answer every question put to me completely honestly. Mr. Harrington sat across the table with 2 members of the audit team beside him. He looked tired, more tired than I had seen him look in the 7 years I had worked for him. He asked me one question to start. Did anyone besides you have authorized access to your working draft folders prior to the March 14th meeting? No, I said clearly. According to the access permissions I had personally set, and according to the system records, those folders were restricted to my credentials only. The room was quiet for a brief moment. One of the auditors wrote something in her notebook. Mr. Harrington nodded slowly, the kind of nod that belongs to someone confirming something they already know but needed to hear said out loud, and placed on the record. The rest of the meeting was procedural, follow-up questions about specific dates, file names, and system settings. But I understood completely what that first question meant. They already knew the answer. They simply needed it documented. The access log I had printed and set aside months earlier became the most critical document in the entire case. The auditors had pulled the same records through official company channels, with far deeper technical access than I had available to me. What they found was later summarized in the formal audit findings, a copy of which I was eventually given. The working draft folders I had maintained on the internal drive, the ones restricted to my login credentials only, had been accessed 6 separate times in the 2 weeks leading up to the March meeting. Not one of those 6 access events matched my own login activity. Every single entry was traced back to Daniel's credentials. His explanation, when the auditors confronted him directly, was that he had accessed the files for collaborative purposes, that as my brother and a fellow senior employee, he had assumed that shared access between family members working in the same company was acceptable practice. But there was no collaboration request on record. No email asking my permission. No formal note of any kind suggesting this access had ever been discussed, agreed upon, or authorized by anyone. And the documents he had fabricated, the ones submitted with false creation dates, had been built directly from data pulled out of those restricted folders during those 6 unauthorized visits. The picture was complete now. Fully documented. Undeniable. My brother had broken into my private files, stolen my data, used it to destroy my promotion, and then fabricated evidence when the investigation began. The truth had fully arrived. My father called me on a Thursday evening about 1 week before the audit formally concluded. His voice was different from the last time we had spoken about any of this. The steadiness that normally held his words together was fraying noticeably at the edges. He told me he had finally spoken to Daniel directly, that word had reached the family that things were becoming very serious, and he had sat Daniel down and asked him plainly whether he had crossed a line. He said Daniel had talked around the question, had used phrases like misunderstanding and different interpretations of file access protocols. Had never once said the word no. My father went quiet on the phone for a moment after telling me that. I should have listened to you sooner, he said. I held the phone without speaking immediately. Those 5 words from a man who rarely admitted to being wrong about anything carried more weight than I could easily put into language. I told him I appreciated him saying so. I told him I wasn't carrying anger toward him, which was mostly the truth. I told him what mattered now was allowing the process to run its course, and then moving forward from whatever came next. After we hung up, I sat by my window for a long time. My father hadn't believed me fully when I first came to him in those painful early days. But he believed me completely now. And somewhere quietly inside that, something that had been tight and aching in my chest finally, slowly loosened. Leadership scheduled the reconvening meeting for a Tuesday, 3 weeks after my private session with Mr. Harrington. I was told the purpose of the meeting was to allow me to present a corrected account of the Horizon Project proposal, to formally clarify, on the record, how my original work had been misrepresented at the March meeting. I prepared for 4 solid days. Not because I was nervous. I had moved well past nervous. I prepared because I wanted the presentation to be so logically organized, so clearly sequenced, so thoroughly supported by documented evidence that there would be no room left for any confusion or legitimate doubt. I opened with my original proposal, complete and unaltered, and walked through its framework section by section. Then I showed the draft documents Daniel had accessed without my knowledge or authorization. Then the timestamp inconsistency. Then the direct contradictions between his memo and his own spreadsheet. Then I placed the access logs on the screen. I presented everything the way a scientist presents research data, without dramatic pauses, without a raised voice, without a single word that could be read as personal grievance. Just facts, arranged in chronological order, allowing the people in that room to draw their own conclusions without any guidance from me. I spoke for 22 minutes. Nobody interrupted once. At the end, Mr. Harrington looked down at the table in front of him without speaking. The lead auditor made a final, deliberate note in her folder. The room was very, very quiet. Daniel had not been told the real purpose of the reconvening meeting. He had been informed it was a general project review, standard procedure following the audit, nothing unusual. He sat 2 seats down from me at the conference table with his own notepad in front of him, pen ready, his expression professionally neutral and relaxed. He was still performing, still confident, still certain he had survived. I watched him from the corner of my eye during the opening minutes of my presentation. He wrote something in his notepad. He nodded slightly at certain points, as though reviewing information he was already familiar with. Then I clicked to the slide showing the timestamp inconsistency, his concerns raised 4 days before the draft he claimed to have reviewed even existed. He stopped writing. I clicked to the contradictions between his memo and his own spreadsheet. His pen lowered to the table slowly, like air leaving something inflated. I clicked to the access logs, his credentials, my restricted folders, 6 unauthorized entries across the 2 weeks before the meeting. He didn't look at his notepad again. He stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen, as if he couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he had believed was going to happen inside that room. The easy posture was gone. The performance had collapsed completely. He sat with his hands flat on the table, his face drained of color, very still. He had walked into that room as the man who had won. He now understood, fully and finally, that he hadn't won anything at all. The audit conclusions were delivered formally on a Friday afternoon. The language in the official report was measured and precise, the way all serious professional documents are written. But stripped of the careful phrasing, the findings were completely clear. My original Horizon Project proposal had been found sound and thoroughly researched. The risk concerns Daniel had raised at the March meeting were determined to be based on selectively extracted data, deliberately presented out of context in order to mislead. The timestamp inconsistency was officially noted and documented. The contradictions between his follow-up memo and his own original spreadsheet were fully recorded. The unauthorized access to my restricted file folders was confirmed. 6 separate entries, every one of them traced to Daniel's credentials, with no record of authorization, collaboration request, or prior discussion of any kind. The fabricated supporting documents, the ones he had submitted to the audit team with false digital creation dates, were flagged as a serious breach of company conduct policy. Daniel was formally removed from the Horizon Project, effective immediately. A secondary internal review into his conduct was opened. HR told me nothing specific about what that review would recommend, but the gravity present in every brief exchange made the seriousness abundantly clear. There was no shouting in hallways, no dramatic confrontation in front of stunned witnesses. Nobody slammed a door or raised their voice above a professional level. Just facts confirmed. Just truth, documented and placed permanently on the record. It was quiet, professional, completely final. And the quietness of it was exactly right. Mr. Harrington called me into his office the following Monday morning. I had anticipated a reinstatement offer. I had thought about this moment for weeks, how I would respond, what I would say, whether I would feel relief or satisfaction or something else entirely when it finally arrived. He told me that leadership wanted me to return to the Horizon Project in my original capacity. He told me the promotion review would be formally reopened with a strong internal recommendation behind my name. I waited for the relief to arrive. It didn't. What I felt instead was something much calmer, something more certain and settled than relief. I thanked Mr. Harrington genuinely for the offer. I told him I respected the steps the company had taken to uncover and confirm the truth. Then I told him, clearly and without apology, that I would not be accepting reinstatement. I slid a formal letter across the desk toward him. My resignation, effective in 30 days. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at me. "You're sure?" he said. "I am," I said. I explained that I had accepted a senior leadership position at Vantage Group, Director of Strategic Projects, beginning the following month at a level above where I currently sat. He nodded slowly, and something passed across his expression that I hadn't expected to see there. Not surprise. Respect. At the far end of the conference table, Daniel sat frozen, his notepad untouched and unopened. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone they are seeing clearly for the very first time. The 30 days passed more quickly than I had expected. I handed off my remaining responsibilities carefully and thoroughly. I trained the person covering my projects during the transition. I replied to the farewell messages that came from colleagues with genuine warmth. There were people at that company I had truly liked, and leaving them behind was the only part of my departure that carried any real weight. Daniel resigned quietly, roughly 2 weeks before my own last day arrived. There was no announcement, no farewell email sent around the office, no gathering in the break room with cake and good wishes. He was simply present one day and gone the next, like a sentence that ends without a proper period. My father called me the evening Daniel's resignation became known within the family. He didn't offer explanations for what Daniel had done. He didn't minimize it or search for softer language. He simply said he was sorry, not just for the situation, but specifically for not standing beside me when I had first come to him with the truth, for asking me to let things cool off instead of choosing to believe his own daughter. That was the apology I had never asked for out loud, but had needed more than I realized. I told him I forgave him, and I meant every word of it fully. I was not carrying bitterness into the next chapter of my life. Bitterness is a weight, and I had too much ahead of me to carry anything that no longer served a purpose. My last day came. I walked out of that building in the late afternoon light, and I did not look back. 8 months after my first day at Vantage Group, I was sitting in my new office reviewing a proposal for a cross-company strategic initiative when my phone buzzed quietly on the desk beside me. The number was Daniel's. I stared at it for a moment. The phone rang twice, then 3 times. I thought about the conference room back in March, the way the room had gone silent when his presentation appeared on the screen where mine had been. I thought about those 3 days of silence after the meeting, about my father's kitchen table and the careful months of documentation, about the cold, still expression on Daniel's face when he finally understood what was happening in that reconvening room. I thought about who I had been before all of this, someone who worked hard and expected fairness to follow naturally, who had trusted family over evidence, who had never imagined that the person most capable of hurting her would be someone she had grown up sitting beside at the dinner table. And I thought about who I had become after, someone who had chosen strategy over reaction, facts over feelings, and her own future over the comfort of a system that had failed her completely. My phone went quiet. Daniel had reportedly pursued senior positions at 2 other firms in the months since leaving. Neither opportunity had come through. In professional circles, reputations travel quietly, but with remarkable efficiency. I set the phone face down and returned to my proposal. I hadn't needed to say a single word. The life I had built without him said everything that needed to be said.